I'm Clair Barrus, and you are listening to Gospel Tangents.
It's the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Gospel Tangents is supported by users like you. Please support us at gospeltangents.com or on Patreon. I'm excited to have Clair Barrus on the show. He signed a copy of Secret Covenants, New Insights into Mormon Polygamy, and I'm going to be giving away a copy of this book here to one of you. Make sure you enter by July 27th. To go to gospeltangents.com/contest, and you could win this copy here, signed by Clair, Cheryl Bruno, and Marianne Clements. So Clair's going to be talking about the early polygamy revelations, and we're going to go as early as 1829. That surprised me. I knew about 1831, but we'll talk about some possible evidence even earlier. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome, everybody, to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to be here with an amazing author and historian. Go ahead and tell us who you are, and you're the author of what book?
Rick, I'm glad to be here. I'm Clair Barrus, and I have a chapter in this compilation of essays on early plural marriage. It's edited by Cheryl Bruno, and it's called Secret Covenants, New Insights to Early Mormon Polygamy. It's published by Signature Books, and I have a chapter in here on the marriage revelations of Joseph Smith.
All right, and that's what we're here to talk about. I'm excited about that. Also excited because you signed a copy of, or you signed your chapter along with Cheryl Bruno and Marianne Clements, and we're excited to give away a copy here at gospeltangents.com/contest. And so you can, at the conclusion of our interview here, we're going to give away a signed copy here. So I'm excited about that. So, Clair, I remember back, I don't know how many years, you probably know better than me, you did a similar presentation to your chapter at Sunstone on Joseph Smith's Revelations. So you've been studying this for years.
Yeah, I did. This emerged not too long after the Gospel Topics essays came out on plural marriage, and I started, my wheels started going, and I went down the rabbit hole, and I emerged with a Sunstone presentation, and I think I did a podcast on the plural marriage revelations of Joseph Smith.
Do you remember when that presentation was?
I don't.
It's probably been at least 5 years.
Yeah, or more. I think maybe even more than that. But It's been a little while.
Because the essays, the first ones came out in 2012, so 2013, 2014, you think?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yep. And so Cheryl Bruno, the editor of the book, at some point said, I could use another chapter or two. And I says, well, I do have this old thing that I did. I could dust it off. And she's like, let's do it. Yeah. So that's why this emerged from an earlier work that I had done that I'd really set aside, but I'm glad Cheryl expressed interest and was able to make it a little bit better and published it in this book.
Yeah, well, great. Because I was at that presentation in Sunstone, whatever it was.
Good. I'm glad you remembered.
And I was impressed. So.
Nice. Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I
probably should have gotten you, 10 years ago or something. But. So anyway, so the first thing that I thought was pretty interesting, in D&C 132 in the preface, it says that the D&C 132 was known to Joseph Smith as early as 1831. Right. Can you talk about that? What evidence do we have of an 1831 revelation?
Well, and Rick, there is some possible evidence of even as early as 1829.
Oh, really?
When Joseph Smith is translating the Book of Mormon, you have the Jacob II reference to polygamy. And there's two ways to read that. It's a very convoluted text. And if you read it, most people interpret it that God says, monogamy is the standard, but if I command otherwise to raise up a righteous generation, so be it. Then I'll do it.
Most of the people look at it as a complete condemnation of polygamy.
But that's another way to read it, is that it's a condemnation of polygamy, period, without a caveat that polygamy is okay. And I think it can be read both ways because the syntax is not easy to sort through.
If I recall, I think most people read it as a condemnation, but it was a Community of Christ, or I should say RLDS at the time, historian who said, well, there is kind of this caveat that God could command polygamy.
Yeah, and the LDS Church has interpreted it that way too.
Yeah.
Right. So that could be the earliest reference to the possibility of polygamy in the Mormon tradition.
Is it okay if God commands it?
Yes, and Brigham Young remembers that Brigham Young says that there was a revelation about plural marriage at that time when they're translating that text, and he says that Oliver took it a little bit too seriously and ended up engaging in a plural marriage relationship that he shouldn't have.
Yeah, that's a crap charge, though, isn't it?
Yeah, right. I don't know of any evidence that backs.
I mean, it really stems from Oliver accusing Joseph of adultery with Fanny Alger, and so then Brigham's like just trying to dirty up Oliver and say, well, Oliver was involved in polygamy. To me, it's a very spurious charge.
And I haven't looked at the details of that, but except from the fact that there's a claim that there was a revelation. Brigham Young said there was a revelation at the time of the translation of Jacob 2. And so I note that in this chapter because it's a revelation, possible revelation
and
about
so that's
plural
as
marriage.
early as the summer of 1829.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So there's that. But then we jump to 1831, and we have Joseph Smith and some other elders travel from the Kirtland area to Missouri to the border of the Lamanites. Now, at the time, there was Indian territory just across, just over from where the Saints had settled in Missouri. No white people were allowed in there unless they had a valid reason and the Indian agent would allow them in. And they would not allow Joseph Smith and the others into Indian territory to preach. They wanted to preach to convert the Lamanites, to fulfill some of the revelations Joseph Smith had, and this was a big deal to them, and they really wanted to get in. Joseph had at least two revelations that sanctioned attempts to try to get into Indian territory. One had to do with selling goods. Maybe if we were selling goods to the Indians, we could be allowed in. And there's an actual revelation associated with that. But then there was a second revelation called the Matrimonial Alliance Revelation, which was a revelation that Joseph Smith had, basically saying, if we set up a matrimonial alliance with the natives, with Martin Harris possibly marrying a Lamanite or
he's
an American
now,
Indian.
right?
No, he's not divorced.
Oh, okay.
He's estranged from his wife, and so, but he is technically married. And there's some text that indicates that maybe we shouldn't proceed because he's still legally married. And so there is, they're like, yeah, we had to have Martin marry, and then like, well, maybe not. And it's possible that some of the other elders who were all married and had non-estranged marriages might have been indicated in that also. So W.W. Phelps remembers it on two occasions later, and he kind of indicates that it might have been more than just Martin Harris that was associated with this, which would have been technically polygamy if they would have gone ahead with that. But we get the information from a guy named Ezra Booth, who was one of the elders, but he becomes disaffected. And then 6 months after this revelation, he writes about it. And he doesn't indicate that it had anything to do with polygamy as it would become late, as we would get to know it later. He just said it was a matrimonial alliance. He would have pounced all over it if Joseph Smith had revealed polygamy. But I think, though, that also in 1831, Joseph Smith is translating Genesis, which has to do with different patriarchs engaging in plural marriage in Genesis. And so Joseph is encountering this idea of plural marriage. We have this matrimonial alliance revelation, and Mormonism, which is emerging out of the burned over district during the Second Great Awakening. All of the religions that I'm aware of that were emerging at that time, all were experimenting with marriage to one extent or the other. Some saying celibacy is the way to go, other having complex marriages. And so this seems to be a thing at the time to reconsider to marriage. So I think Joseph's wheels begin, at the very least, to begin turning in 1831 and considering plural marriage. He talks to some associates who later recall that 1831 was when he had a revelation about plural marriage. And also in 1831, he went back to the Kirtland area. He lived with the Johnsons, and they had a 16-year-old daughter, Marinda Nancy Johnson, who later Joseph proposes to. And she recalls that Joseph said that he had a revelation about her in 1831.
Oh, wow.
Which was the time that he was living in their home. Now, this is getting a little out in the speculative realm, but
This is when they were in Kirtland, is that right?
Yes, this is when they're in Kirtland, and this is when the mob comes in. They get Sidney and Joseph, and they drag them out in the middle of the winter, and there's a late story that, but it's from one of the Johnson relatives that they wanted to castrate Joseph Smith. And that's a common reprisal for sex crimes. So there's that piece of information, but
they didn't, clearly they didn't
tenuous.
castrate him.
No, they didn't do it, and that may or may not be accurate.
Yeah.
But it's important to point out that it is in the historical record, and it's something that we ought to consider.
But it's a late source?
That's a late source, yes.
Okay. How late?
I'd have to look it up, but it's in the 1860s, 70s, 80s.
So it's like 30 years late.
Quite a bit later, yeah. But as I recall, it's from one of the Johnson, an uncle. It's not somebody who knew a Johnson who knew a Johnson. It was one of the Johnsons. So you have to take it at least with some seriousness. You can't just write it off completely. Anyway, you have these elements in 1831 that are several different things: the matrimonial revelation, the translation of the Old Testament, and this encounter with Nancy Marinda. At least an interest that's expressed, according to Nancy, as Joseph told her, a revelation that Joseph supposedly had in 1831 that Nancy was to be his.
Is that also a late source?
Yes, this is Marinda Nancy, and she is claiming this, and it's in the latter 18.
Is it part of the temple lot or something else?
No, I don't think it's that, and I'd have to look it up to see exactly what it is, Rick. But I can't recall. But that's her recollection. Interestingly, along with that story, she says that Joseph told Orson Hyde, "Don't marry Marinda," but he married her anyway. And then Joseph, and we're jumping ahead a little bit, but Joseph writes up a revelation and gives it to Wilford Woodruff, who delivers it to Marinda. And I keep flipping between Nancy and Marinda, but it's Marinda Nancy Hyde.
They're the same person.
Same person. I want to clarify that for the listeners.
Did she go by Marinda more or Nancy more or both?
Well, that's a good question. we with the editors, we settled on Marinda. I had been going with Nancy.
Oh yeah, I have too.
And they said, well, we think it's Marinda, and I actually looked up references, and I think they used Nancy more, the historians, but anyway, we went with Marinda.
Okay.
Marinda. So Wilford Woodruff delivers this revelation to Marinda, and it says, you are to follow the instructions that Joseph is teaching you. among other things. It's talking about a place where she can live and so forth. Her husband's on a mission. She doesn't have a lot of money. She needs, having a hard time, I guess, having a place to live. And this revelation is about that. But it's also said, follow Joseph's teachings. Well, she said that Joseph had been teaching her about celestial marriage, which was the equivalent of plural marriage at the time, and that it would be a blessing to her and her children, a kind of a posterity blessing kind of thing, which is a common theme in these plural marriage revelations that Joseph Smith has. So there is that. Then,
what year is this revelation and the delivery by Woodruff?
This is probably in 1841 or two. And again, I can't remember the dates, but it's one of the earlier ones. I think it's going to be in 1841. Then Orson. Then she gets. So in Joseph's.
Is this the one where Orson's on a mission and comes back and he's so distraught he almost commits suicide?
No, this is another Orson. Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt, which
I'm
can be confusing.
thinking of Pratt. So you're talking about Hyde.
We're talking about Hyde, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Orson Hyde is on a mission. We have two recorded dates for her marriage, curiously, and they're different dates. The first one is before Orson comes back from his mission.
Orson Hyde comes back from his mission.
Yes, Orson Hyde. And then there's a second date recorded a little bit after he's back. Well,
so let me ask you this, because I was just talking with Marianne Clements concerning the Theodore Turley, and it sounds like with the three sisters, I think that Sarah, if my memory is correct, got married in 1842, but sealed in 1844. And so there were two separate ceremonies. There was a marriage ceremony, and then there was a sealing ceremony, and they were 2 years apart. Is this a similar thing that may have happened with Nancy Marinda Hyde?
Here's what, that's a good question, and we can't know the answer. But what one possible explanation is, Orson Hyde comes back from his mission. She's already married, but he doesn't.
Married to Joseph.
So
it's a polyandrous thing here.
It's a polyandrous thing without Orson Hyde's knowledge. Orson may or may not have found out right away. It doesn't matter to the story, but at some point, Orson Hyde becomes converted to plural marriage. He then marries his first plural wife, and then the second date, and then later he marries another plural wife. But in between those two marriages, Marinda is sealed. That's the second sealing date that we have for Marinda. It's possible she was sealed a second time to Joseph Smith, because maybe Orson didn't know about the first sealing, and once he got converted to polygamy, then they convinced him. Joseph convinced him to let him marry his wife, and so there was another marriage for the sake of Orson Hyde. That's one possible interpretation of why we have two dates for that.
Okay, so the first date is a marriage to Joseph, or sealing. The second one is a sealing to make it official.
Well, the first marriage of Marinda to Joseph was done without Orson Hyde's knowledge. The second one was done after Orson Hyde had converted to polygamy, and maybe he was not even aware that she had already married Joseph, but they did a marriage to have him go, okay, that's good.
So
maybe this is pure speculation. Was she never sealed
to Orson Hyde then?
What's that?
Was Nancy Marinda never sealed to Orson Hyde?
Well, Rick, yeah, the words married and sealing, I'm using those kind of interchangeably.
Right.
And I don't, that's a good question. There's a list of marriages in Joseph Smith's journal. I don't know if it said a list of sealings or a list of marriages. And I'm kind of conflating those together in my mind. So
a lot of people do.
Yes. But I think it's wise to try to distinguish those and try to, like, how were they different, and ask that question. And that's a question that I have not dived into.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is in modern day, we do equate marriage and sealing together because most of the time, if you're LDS and if you're good LDS, you get married in the temple, you get sealed on the same day. Now, if you're a convert and you got married outside the church, we'll recognize that marriage, but we don't recognize it as a sealing until you get sealed in the temple. And so the problem with Nauvoo is the temple wasn't completed until, parts of it were completed before Joseph's death, but a lot of the sealings took place after Joseph's death. And so it really becomes fuzzy as to, was this marriage a sealing or not?
Right.
And especially with talking with Marianne, it sounds like with the Clift sisters that some of them were married first and then they were sealed a couple of years later after the temple was completed.
Well, and I know that happened with, a lot of people went back to the temple to make it more official than it already was.
But
and there's
those,
something about
those
doing
first
it in
ones
a temple.
probably were a sealing as well. Because I know in talking with polygamists and even reading some of the histories, you could get plurally sealed on a train. Like it doesn't have to be in a temple. Clearly if Joseph was sealed to some of these women, the temple wasn't complete, so he had to do it outside the temple. And the fundamentalist belief is it's nice to have it in the temple, but it's not necessary.
Right. And the one thing we do know is that in Nauvoo that everybody went back and
once the temple
everything
was
got
complete.
redone once the temple was done. And then I think the same thing may have happened in Utah.
Yeah.
Things were revalidated in the temple because it seemed to have a little more oomph to it.
And more official.
Yeah, it was more official. So beyond that, I don't know.
So it's still pretty fuzzy as to whether these were marriages and sealings or marriages only.
Yes.
So, but it doesn't seem like there was a prohibition that you could be multiple married outside the temple and then just get it sealed later.
Right. I don't see any.
There were no prohibitions on that.
No, I don't. Yeah. I don't see that.
Okay.
Right. So that's kind of the. I don't know. We were talking about 1831, and we kind of zipped up to.
No, then we went
Hydes.
to Hydes. Yeah.
And
because that was the next. You said it was because Nancy Marinda said that Joseph told her he had a revelation as early as 1831 that he should marry her. Yeah. Instead, she marries Orson Hyde, sends Orson on a mission. Joseph says, "Hey, let's get married."
Yep.
Or sealed. I don't know. That's still confusing as to what exactly happened. Orson comes back, accepts polygamy. Then Joseph and Nancy Marinda officially seal with Orson's knowledge this time. And in between, Orson sealed to two other women. So it sounds like Orson was never sealed to Nancy Marinda Hyde, but even though they were married. Is that a fair statement?
I haven't looked into that, Rick.
Okay.
So I couldn't tell you. I have focused solely.
You were on Joseph. Yeah.
I've had a very narrow focus in my analysis. Like, was there a revelation?
Right.
If there was, then I try to fill in the details around it, and that's about
so. It sounds like there was one in 1831 for Nancy Marinda. Then in 1841, a decade later, Wilford Woodruff delivers a second revelation to Nancy and says, "Hey, you're supposed to be married." Orson's on a mission in, probably, I don't know.
I think
Europe
in
or
England,
something.
probably, yeah.
Yeah. And then, so in 1841. Okay. So are there any more details to that story?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Clair Barrus. He's one of the authors of Secret Covenants, New Insights into Mormon Polygamy. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about Fanny Alger and the 1835 Declaration on Marriage.
Yeah, they've been charged with the crime of polygamy and fornication or something like that. But it's a denial saying these rumors you're hearing,
Don't believe them.
We're don't believe them. And I in this chapter I document there's I think 4 other denials that occur before the 1840s or up into the 1840s.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.